Well, thank you all very much for being here. We've got a packed room, so this is the last presentation of this series for this semester on our EH&S brown bag talk series. Okay, and today's topic is head lice and lousy information. Head lice being some of my favorite creatures. I'm going to start this off actually with a video, a news broadcast from just a couple of days ago. And let's see if I can get this to work. Bear with me a moment.
Doctors don't see it, but a school nurse keeps finding nits on both of her daughter's heads. Someone cites Jason Pierce and made a trip to Ashblack, where the family was in court this morning.
Lisa Brooks says her daughters have missed over 2 dozen days of school this year. Their grades are suffering, they're being bullied, and a judge is threatening to put them in state custody all over head lice that she says does not exist. On April 29th, Lisa Brooks was called to pick up her daughter at school again.
As soon as I left the school, took her straight to the doctor. The doctor said, I don't see nothing in his contact.
Lisa returned to school with a note from Dr. Tim Young stating that he found no active lice or nits. But Highland Middle School nurse Amanda Strickland, hired by the district in February, disagreed and refused to allow her to return that day. Highland Schools has gone even further than that, notifying EH&S a Finn's case was open. Brooks says last month, Judge Kevin King threatened to have her daughter's head shaved in court. She says on Wednesday, Judge King took things even further.
The judge told me that if the head lice situation is not taken care of by June 8th, then they're going to be in foster care.
All this despite several doctor visits that have failed to detect any lice or nits on either daughter's head. And even if nits were found, according to the CDC, students diagnosed with live head lice do not need to be sent home early from school. That the burden of unnecessary absenteeism to the students, families, and communities far outweighs the risks associated with head lice. Highland School Superintendent Tracy Webb told us in an off-camera interview that the district has a no-nits policy and that school nurses have the ultimate say regarding whether or not a student has head lice. Webb says that she is aware of the CDC's belief that no-nits policies should be discontinued. Brooks and her daughters are due back in court on June 8th. Back to you.
Jason, thanks a lot. Let us know what happens.
Okay, so that's a good way to start this. That's just from this past week, and that's representative of what I see virtually every day in the news media. Incidents of head lice occur across the country, across the world, but schools continue to pursue these policies that criminalize the kids and the parents, and it leads to court cases, to exclusion from school, and yet worse, as you saw here. And we're not immune to that in Massachusetts. I've been involved with more than a few court cases here where judges have ordered results as was described in this case. Okay, a few other things from the media. We see quite often, almost every day, if you did a Google search on head lice, you'd see this discussions about so-called super lice. It sort of suggests that lice wear capes, they can fly, they can jump tall buildings. You know, what's this all about? I'll speak about that momentarily. Is this reality or just a good example of marketing excesses? Those who like to watch comedies on TV, this is Modern Family, one of the more popular shows. It's from February 2014, where there's supposedly a case of head lice at home, and this is emblematic of what often happens. Parents don't want to touch their kids. They don't want to be around their kids because they're afraid they too will get lice. Then there's this nonsense about selfies. people taking pictures of themselves and putting their heads together, and this has made the media news wires for about a year now. And I still get inquiries from the media about one a week. Is this true? Well, I don't think so. But more about this coming up as well. So, on the grand scheme of things, for all of the sorts of creatures and pathogens that I deal with fairly often, where the head lice fall out on this graph. Morbidity being the extent of disease exceeding, going towards the right there. So triple E at the bottom is deadly in most cases. No question about that, a horrible thing to get. But the level of concern by the general public seems to be fairly low for the most part. What's up there on top? Well, spiders, bed bugs, things like that. Where do head lice fit in? Well, I think based on my several decades of working with head lice, it's right up there on top. Parents generally are far more worried about head lice than things that actually cause much more harm. So, some myths to dispense with. Most parents and healthcare providers mistakenly believe that head lice cause disease by direct harm and or by transmitting pathogens, so disease-causing organisms. That head lice are shared readily and cause epidemics. Have mutated to superlice, I mentioned that before, and are resistant to all treatments, and that they can and must be eradicated. Also, that there's this mistaken belief that lice can jump, fly, and survive for weeks off of a host. Yet more, many parents mistakenly believe that the presence of head lice or their eggs, and I'll refer to these throughout this next hour, called nits, is a sign of parental neglect. And that children with head lice or nits must be quarantined or treated immediately. These are all myths. This is all nonsense. But it's so well ingrained in everybody's psyche that it must be true. It's not. So what causes more injury? Head lice or lousy policies? Well, let's look at that. Here's an example of a child. This is the before picture. I don't actually have an after picture. Jessica Brooks burned on February 22nd after dousing her hair with gasoline. Why did she do that? Because she thought she had head lice. This is a fairly common occurrence. Gasoline, kerosene, xylene, all sorts of things people will pour on their heads, on their children's heads, on their friends' heads, on their grandkids' heads, because somebody thinks that this is going to be effective. Actually, if you pour gasoline over a head louse, that louse will die. But the problem is it can ignite, and then you have permanent injury to, in this case, the child, lifelong. So to add insult to injury, there actually, in this case, and in many cases like it, there's some question as to whether she actually had head lice in the first place. Then there's this Tri-Village school district in Ohio that announced a couple years ago that they're going to be closed tomorrow to give you, the parents, time to have your students treated and the building cleaned. Right? Buildings get head lice? They don't. The Charleston Daily Mail, this from 2006, students in Kanawha County missed 2,306 days of school because of head lice. That's a phenomenal number of days lost in a single school year. So prior to the new policy, school attendance officers had complained that some students missed so many days of school that their parents might have to be taken to court. There were other students who had to skip a grade because they had so many head lice-related absences. And this still goes on in school districts across the country and in some other places. So a little bit about what are head lice. They're insects, primitive insects. They live only on people, usually found on children, never on pets. They occur only on the scalp hair. They feed only on blood. They can't feed on anything else. They do not and they cannot burrow into the skin. They're ectoparasites. The parasites live on the outside of the body. They lay eggs that hatch after about 9 days of incubation. And the hatchlings mature about 9 days later. The adults then mate and can start the egg-laying process all over again for the next generation. So this is what this cartoon is sort of what the life cycle looks like. They start with an egg. What hatches, one nymph hatches from one egg. This feeds, grows, and then becomes an adult about 9 days later. It's either a male or a female. So who gets lice? Well, just about every kind of animal that you look at has its own kind of lice. Elephants have elephant lice, and look at the length of the proboscis on that elephant louse up there on the top left. It's to get through the thick skin. Dogs get dog lice. Birds have a whole variety of bird lice. Gerbils, guinea pigs get their own lice. Gorillas have their own lice, and humans have lice. Our books get lice as well, except that they're so distantly related that they don't blood feed. They feed on the pages of the book and on the sizing and the glue that holds it all together, but they're absolutely no significance to health. So there are three types of human lice. There's the human body louse, lives on the clothing, the human head louse, which is only up on the scalp hair, and the human pubic louse, otherwise known as the crab louse, which lives down where the sun doesn't usually shine. So the body louse and head louse look very similar. This could be either, I know which it is, but for all intents and purposes they're almost identical in looks. And that's the crab louse for obvious reasons. It has a more crab-like appearance. I'm going to talk mainly or almost exclusively about head lice here. So this is a close-up of a louse. It's actually a very exquisite creature. Notice it's not burrowing into the skin. It's on the skin surface, and that's where it stays. The business end. Here, this is a close-up of the face of a louse, and that's a close-up of the mouth parts in the top right there. So it's not this long proboscis like you find in a mosquito. It's a little invertible set of stylets that come out and probe for a capillary in the skin. And here we have two, these are body lice, but they could be head lice, and two crab lice there doing acrobatics. And this is kind of interesting. These are the claws that easily can distinguish between a head louse or a body louse and a pubic louse. And those grasp the hair. They don't grasp skin, they don't grasp anything else. They're just holding on to hair. It's like little vice grips, very effectively and slowly wandering through hair. Okay, so a little bit about their development. So they go from egg to nymph, and there are three stages of the nymphs. These are the immatures. Then you get an adult female or a male, and then the whole cycle starts all over again. So it's about 9 to 11 days for the eggs to develop. I said earlier 9 days, but if it's cool, it can be an extra day or so. Each of those nymphal stages takes about 3 days, 4 at most. And then about a day or so after the louse matures to the female, she can start to lay eggs. And that's the elapsed time out there. And an adult will survive up to about a month on a person's head. Usually it's far less than that. Off-host, lice don't survive long at all. If you took lice and put them on the tabletop, within hours, most of them will be dead, and by tomorrow, they're all going to be dead. They dry out quickly, and the only way they can replenish the moisture in their body is by blood feeding, and there's nothing to feed on the tabletop or on the rug or on a sofa. And they also will starve to death. So a little bit ecological differences. Why do we fear lice so much? Because other kinds of lice are important from a public health standpoint. So head lice are restricted to the scalp hair of human beings. They're most prevalent amongst the school-age kids in the kindergarten through about 4th grade levels. Interestingly, in the United States, well, all of North America, prevalence is lowest amongst black children, whether they be African American or foreign national. And we can talk about that later if anyone wants to. But amongst all other groups, it's about 1 out of 100 kids that are affected. They don't care how thick your wallet is, how fancy your house is, or how clean it is, and they're transmitted mainly by direct head-to-head contact. So in contrast, the other kinds of lice, the body lice and the pubic lice, the body lice are mainly on clothing and body hair, affecting mainly adults. Again, they don't care about your racial background, but they're mainly found on folks who call a refrigerator box home. So they're in the indigent population. You find them. If you went to search here in Cambridge or in Boston, you just go down to one of the shelters and you look at enough people, you would find a few. You'll never find them on a child in this country, though. They're transmitted directly by direct contact, sharing of clothing, and bedding. And then the pubic lice, mainly adults, come down with them. It's a sexually transmitted condition. Rarely does it show up in kids, occasionally, and it's usually because of inappropriate contact, but not always. Okay, so how do you diagnose whether a child has head lice? Well, you find the creature. Simply because somebody is doing this doesn't mean they have head lice. Everybody's had itches, and actually, of the many in the room here, most of you have already scratched your head since I began talking. So you look for it. It's a small creature. You don't need special devices to see it. You might need a microscope to distinguish whether it's a head louse or something else. Make sure it's alive. If it's not moving, then it doesn't really matter if it's a louse or not. It's of no importance. And then confirm that it is a louse. Okay, so who's good at diagnosing or identifying lice on people's heads? School nurses are amongst the most, they have the best track record. So about 70% of the things that they call head lice are head lice. Problem is that of those, about half, or actually less than half of them, it's just evidence of what's now an extinct infestation. So the kid has cleared him or herself of lice. There's still some remnants of old eggs on the hair, but the nurses tend not to distinguish between living and dead. And that's a big problem. But school nurses are amongst the best to do this. Teachers, kids' relatives, barbers, beauticians, physicians have a terrible track record, and those who try to self-diagnose, it's abominable. So nurses tend to be far better than physicians. Physicians tend they don't even want to see kids with head lice. Don't bring them into my waiting room. Seriously, because they're misinformed as well. So the upshot of this is you could flip a coin as your sole means of diagnosis and be right more often than the way it's done in the vast majority of places. That's terrible, but that's reality. One of the problems is that most things that people call lice are not. They can be other kinds of bugs, they can be knots in the hair, just debris, cookie crumbs, dandruff, you name it. But fewer than half of the objects that are found are associated with lice. So the take-home message, errors are the rule, not the exception. So what other kinds of bugs might be mistaken for lice? Well, these are all about the same size. These are springtails. These are incredibly common, ubiquitous creatures out in everybody's garden, but they can't bite. They never do. And book lice, over there on the right, you all have book lice running around in your old books at home. And they might crawl on you, but they can't bite. They have no interest in you, unless you're made out of paper. But people mistaken those to be head lice all the time. So that thing in the middle is a head louse. Even worse is the ability of people to correctly identify louse eggs or nits. So the top two things there are, well, all four up there are genuine louse eggs, head louse eggs, attached to a hair shaft. Top left is an egg that was recently deposited just a day or so before. I can tell by looking at that microscopically it's healthy, and it might develop, might not. The second one, you can see a little eye spot. You can even see the legs are developing louse inside. That creature actually would be moving if this was a video. Ready to hatch out. So obviously that person had an active infestation. The third thing, those are empty eggs. So after the hatchling leaves, the eggshell remains firmly glued onto the hair, and it will stay there for days, weeks, months, and sometimes for years. Yet that thing is often mistaken, very frequently is mistaken to be a sign of lice. Well, all it is it's evidence of it's a relic. It's an example of what used to be there, but doesn't say whether the child is still infested. And then a lot of eggs just never develop, and they just remain there. They're dead eggs. The other things that are often mistaken to be louse eggs, these things that I call pseudonits, this is just a bit of skin debris that's stuck onto the hair. Knotted hair, roots, and then just debris of various types. I've looked at tens of thousands, probably 100,000 or more samples over the years of what are thought to be louse eggs. And I see these things very frequently. And I've published on this in the medical literature. Again, misdiagnosis is the rule, not the exception. And that leads to a tremendous amount of time lost in school, lots of overtreatment, and yet other problems. So how do you get head lice? Well, when I was a kid, I remember very few things from being a child in elementary school. But the one thing I remember quite well is when they line up the boys and the girls in the hallway to go down to the lunchroom, the boys would be all on one side and the girls on the other. And although the teachers wanted us to all hold hands, the boys didn't want to touch the girls. Why? Because we all knew that the girls had cooties. We didn't know what cooties were, but we knew we didn't want to touch them. So, a cootie is just another name for a louse. So most people think you get head lice by sharing or using somebody else's comb, headphones, helmets, hats, and you name it. No, that's absolute nonsense. The lice would be laughing at that. They do all the time whenever they hear that suggestion. So if it happens once this year that a single head louse will transfer that way, I'll say, okay, once is okay. Twice, I'd be surprised. I think this is the main method. This isn't an antique, this cootie game. They still sell these, except this one's from 1950 or so. I have that one at home. So two kids doing something very wholesome, playing together. They get their heads together. So if either of those children had head lice, those lice could easily grab onto another hair. It might belong to another child or an adult, doesn't matter. So this is the picture of how I think head lice are mainly transmitted. Similarly, all these wholesome activities, kids and adults put in their heads together, all are opportunities for lice to transfer from person to person. Yet some schools actually try to keep kids from touching heads. They come in with rulers and make sure that the desks are X number of feet apart. It's crazy. Of all of these pictures, only these two kids in the middle, perhaps they're putting each other at risk. You don't get lice from dogs, from dummies, stuffed animals, hugging trees. You're not going to get head lice. And this gentleman here, he has nothing to worry about. Why? There's not much up there in terms of hair. So without hair, there's no risk of getting head lice. So this is a picture that's often used to argue that combs are important. This has made the rounds for about 2 decades now, and say, see, there's a head louse on that comb, on the tooth. Well, that's true. That is a head louse. In fact, these are all head lice. And I can tell by looking at these, they're all dead. They're all dark, the legs are curled up. And even if that was living, how could a louse, you saw the magnified view of the claws earlier, how could they grasp a tooth of that comb? They can't. So somebody had to very carefully put the louse there for this picture. And I'm sure that it kept rolling off because you had to balance it just right. This is absolute nonsense. So how could a louse, even if alive, grasp a situation? They can't. I actually was involved with some work. This is my daughter from many, many years ago. And she always just was a disappointment to me because she never brought head lice home from school. And we tried, this is all staged for these pictures, but I actually spent a lot of time in elementary schools trying to understand the epidemiology and the transmission of head lice. And we took a bunch of kids who actually had active cases of head lice. And with the kids' permission, the school's permission, the parents' permission, after this work, we gingerly harvested off all the lice that they had. And some of the kids that took part in this kind of work had 200 or more head lice present at the time that we did the assessment. But what did we try to do? We wanted to find out to what extent could head lice be transferred to things like hats and headphones and brushes. And we did this over and over and over again. Not a single louse and not a single louse egg made the transfer. So, and colleagues of mine from elsewhere around the world have done similar things, and they too have come up with big zeros in terms of effort. So if lice transfer by this method, it's going to be very rare. Wow.
So you put a hat on a person's head who had an active louse infestation and it didn't then come onto the hat?
Correct. What we did, we bought brand new hats, Cincinnati Reds hats actually, because this work was done in Ohio, and we left them on the kids' heads for timed intervals, 10, 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Took the hats off, put them in a Ziploc bag. 3 entomologists scrutinized them carefully, independently, with a microscope, and we all compared notes afterwards, not a single one. You know, it would have been interesting either way it would have played out. If there were lice there, we would say, okay, you know, this is a likely means of transfer. Similarly, the brush here, what we actually did is, I had a graduate student some years ago who looked at the brand new brushes I got from CVS and said, no, that's not right. That doesn't look like the kind of brushes that the women have. What are you talking about? And she pulls out the brush from her purse, and it was actually disgusting. It was wrapped with all this hair from her head. And she said, you have to use these. So we went and bought human hair. Used for hair weaving, and we inspected to make sure there are no mice on it. We wrapped the bunch up on a bunch of brand new brushes. It passed the test of our female graduate students. They all said, yeah, that looks just like mine. And so we took that. Now, the same thing, not a single louse transferred. And then the headphones, this was the open cell foam. So lice could actually walk on it, but they didn't. Okay, now we didn't do the other part to see if we could put lice on these things and transfer them to another child. That would not pass the IRB. Okay, so take-home message here, these sorts of activities, sharing helmets as they do in schools all the time, those shouldn't be banned. And every year I'm contacted by one or another school system that wants to know when can they start their swimming pool again, because somebody was supposedly seen swimming and he or she had head lice. New York City public pools some years ago shut down a pool. It was about 100 degrees in the shade, 4 days. You know, this is the kind of lunacy. People are so worried about it. And several schools had kids practicing on their bikes and doing batting practice without helmets. That doesn't make any sense. So, here's a statement that unfortunately makes it into virtually every scientific publication on lice. And it starts off saying 6 to 12 million cases of head lice per year in the US. This is absolute nonsense. This number actually comes from marketing statistics that were fatal flaws in the way the statistics were arrived upon. But what would that mean? This goes back to 2009, looking at the U.S. Census Bureau. Kids in that kindergarten through 4th grade age group, there are about 24 million kids registered in schools and some number of kids who are homeschooled. But this would mean that about a quarter to half of all kids in that age group would be infested every year by head lice. How could that be? So we went out actually and did a bunch of studies looking. We screened more than 10,000 kids in schools across the country and then did a bunch of kids overseas to try to establish what the actual prevalence was. And on average, it's about 1 in 100 kids in the K through 4th grade levels have an active infestation. So that's 1 kid in every 4 to 5 classrooms would be infested. Now, how many lice would you find on a kid's head? Well, this curve here, this is sort of the standard curve for the parasite load in people or within animals in a population. So the vast majority of kids who have lice, well, the vast majority of kids don't have lice, but of those who do, most have almost no lice. 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe up to 10. A much lower number of kids have several dozen lice. And then there are what I call the gold mines, those kids that I would seek out and spend a lot of money to try to find. Those kids who had these thriving populations of head lice. Why would I look for them? Because I was studying lice at the time and trying to get as many samples as I could for that laboratory study. Okay, so I'm going to blaze through this quickly. Everyone knows, quote unquote, that kids get lice at school. Now, how do they do it? A lot of people think, well, Johnny comes to school with his winter coat and a louse crawls off the coat onto the furry liner, and then he hangs it up on a hook, and then there's another hook 6 inches away with Jane's coat on it, and so the louse goes from one coat to the next and then gets onto Jane and sets up a new infestation. Well, if you run the numbers, so what's the chance that in any elementary school that a child will come in on any given day with head lice? If there are 100 kids there, probability is essentially 1. You can be certain of it, that in every elementary school a kid will come in with lice on most days. The chances of it detaching, getting under the coat, transferring to a second coat, transferring to a new child, and then establishing a new infestation, those numbers become vanishingly small. Could it happen? Yeah, but I think it's absolutely ridiculous to believe that this happens regularly, and I don't think it does. So most people think of, who knows who that is at the top right here?
Pigpen, right?
Pigpen, yeah. So Pigpen was this cartoon character in Charles Schultz's Peanuts. He'd walk around and be shedding dirt wherever he walked. People think of kids who have lice to be akin to Pigpen, that their lice just dropping off all the time. And if that were to happen, those lice would be suicidal lice, because the chances of them finding another human on which they can infest are virtually zero. Once a louse is on the floor, it's not going to get on anybody else. All right, so what's the burden of infestations? I already mentioned this. Generally, there are less than 10 lice per person or per child, but there can be few to hundreds or even thousands of eggs on the scalp hair. Most of the kids who have lice don't even know it. They are asymptomatic. They're at peace with their lice. It's a nice bit of détente. They don't bother the kid doesn't bother the lice. Can it lead to itching? Yes, it does. Usually after several weeks of the initial infestation, there's an allergic reaction, but after a few more weeks, immunological tolerance builds up, and you're no longer itchy. They're there. So, again, you don't bother, the lice don't bother the kid. Financial costs can be pennies if you comb them out, a few dollars, $10 or so for the over-the-counter products, or thousands and thousands of dollars if you use other methods. Cindy?
So you said that the combs are effective in getting them out, but they just don't attach to them?
Well, there's special combs. I'll show pictures of those coming up. They have very fine teeth.
Yeah.
The teeth are very closely pressed to each other. They're so fine that it will strip not only the lice, but also the louse eggs off of the hair. If I had head lice, I could clear my entire scalp of lice and eggs in about 5 minutes. I don't have much hair up here. It's straight, it's fine. Joe, it might take a half hour, an hour to do somebody with hair like you. But with my daughter, you saw the hair that she had off, and when she was little, it was very tangly. You couldn't use a comb because it would cause a lot of pain and suffering. At that point, they didn't want to cause pain and suffering to her. Now, that's a different story. All right, financial cost, loss of school time can be a day. It can be, a kid can lose a year of school, and it actually happens. A lot of schools, if you have 5 or 6 or 7 unexcused absences, that is without a note from the doctor, and even if you had a note from the doctor, they may not believe it, you repeat the grade. Happens all the time. Okay, so are head lice a disease? Well, it depends on who you ask. Head lice can cause itching, but they don't transmit any infections. Body lice can transmit various infections, but we're not talking about body lice. We're talking about head lice. So those with head lice really are not diseased, and they need not avoid contact with others. How do you get rid of head lice? Well, there are 3 main ways to do it. One is by mechanical removal, using combs and other special devices that will strip the lice off the hair. They're over-the-counter and prescription-based preparations to treat, mainly insecticidal in nature. And then habitat modification. So if a person shaves his or her head and the scalp resembles a bowling ball, there's no way a louse can stay there. It'll just roll right off. They grasp the hair, not the skin. So, and a lot of kids actually have decided to shave their own heads. More power to them, but even though I try to talk them out of it all the time, it's a bit excessive. So lots of different kinds of combs and other implements, or even electric combs that zap the lice as you're combing through them. They can be effective, but it's an expensive toy, I think. Then there's a special device that it's actually FDA approved. That it's like a hair dryer on steroids, but it's got all sorts of sensors in it to make sure you don't scald the scalp of whoever's being treated. You need to be trained in order to use this. It's a very expensive and time-consuming process. It will kill the lice by cooking them, by drying them out. It takes about a half hour on average per person being treated.
Is it effective against eggs?
Yes, it can be, but it doesn't remove the eggs. It'll leave those behind, and if you're going to assume that the presence of an egg means you have lice, then it's not going to satisfy.
So you might be getting to this, but so are the lice clinics that people advertise, is it just?
I'm getting to that.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so over-the-counter products, you can go to CVS, Walgreens, Walmart, whatever, Stop and Shop, and buy all of these over-the-counter preparations. They look remarkably different, the color of the package, but they all cost about the same, usually about $10 or a few dollars less. And they all contain either the natural extract of chrysanthemum flowers, the pyrethrins, or their synthetic analogs, the pyrethroids, mainly being permethrin. Works just as well, in fact, maybe even better. They've been used tens of millions of times every year. You can count the number of adverse reactions on one finger every decade, perhaps. It hardly ever happens. They can be effective. One of the problems is that the lice now have become resistant to these ingredients, but they still can be effective. Okay, other products. FDA has 5 registered prescription pediculacides, so anti-louse products. The one on the left, only a few of us in the room would ever have known. It's called Quell. It's no longer sold under that name, hasn't been for years. It contains lindane, and that's a chemical that actually has been banned by some states, not because of safety, but because of water quality issues. So California has banned it because it's too expensive to filter out of the water once it's in the wastewater stream. Not the safest, not the most effective, and it's still widely used because a lot of the older pediatricians only know that product. Malathion, the second one, came back on the market some years ago. That's very effective as well, but it tends to have a bad odor. Then there are more recently several other products. The two on the right actually are these new, I'm not going to call them biotech, but they're really they're modern products that are based on fermentation products. So spinosades and ivermectin are wonderful products used for treating all sorts of parasitic infections, and they're the products of fermentation. So if you think beer is okay, this is only a little bit different. Okay, there are homeopathic remedies available over the market. I have never seen any evidence that these things actually work. The active ingredient in this material, which is widely used, is just table salt. But there's no basis to believe it actually works. There are all sorts of products, there are whole product classes out there. They call themselves louse removers or egg removers or cleaners, but so is any shampoo. That'll clean the lice. It won't necessarily remove them. None of these products have any evidence associated with them that they actually remove lice or eggs. Then there are all sorts of treatments you can spray into carpets, bedding, and furniture. But if you remember what I said a few minutes ago, furniture and rugs don't get lice. Okay, louse repellents, locator sprays, suffocating agents, natural oils. These are the darlings of the alternative medicine folks. Well, perhaps they might have some effect, although it's never been demonstrated. The Federal Trade Commission looked very closely at the claims of this one here on the right and shut them down because they had no evidence to back their claims. I'm going to run through quickly for the sake of time. So what methods of control are not justified? Environmental cleaning. Why clean your environment if the lice don't live in the environment? It's wasting time. Bagging toys and dolls and stuffed animals. No, it has no effect other than causing the child to be upset. Treating with improper products like kerosene and gasoline, mass screening, lining all the kids up and checking all their heads, crazy. Excluding the kids, there's no basis for that. And then taking legal action against the parents. We also know that makes no sense. And I mentioned this, separation anxiety. A lot of schools want to know how far apart their coat hooks should be. I said, however far apart you want them to be, it doesn't matter. The lice don't care. They're not going to go from coat to coat. And there's this device, the Lousy, which is from the Netherlands. They were selling these, and parents were using them, schools were using them, but there's absolutely no evidence that they did anything. Cindy, you asked about these louse salons. Every community seems to have one or several. They're popping up like crazy. Folks, you can pay your money to have somebody pick through your child's head or your head, your scalp hair, and perhaps either treat or remove eggs or the lice themselves. It's an unregulated industry. Problems with it. They diagnose. They look at something on your child's head and say, this is a louse. That's actually a medical diagnosis. Yet, very few of these louse salons have anybody on staff who holds medical credentials. So they're practicing medicine without a license. They comb and cut hair as they're going through the hair and say, oh, here's an egg, I'm going to snip the hair. So they're using scissors and combs, but they are not licensed as barbers or beauticians. So they fall outside of the cosmetology regulations in virtually every state. And then they manufacture and sell pest control products, either for treating the child or your home. Yet the products are rarely, if ever, approved by FDA or EPA, and the salons are not licensed as pest control professionals. So they fall between all sorts of cracks, and they're getting away with absolute murder from that standpoint. Now, some states are actually looking now as to how better to regulate these, but no one has done a good job yet. They all know that there's a problem. Cindy?
So, I guess my thought though is that, I mean, obviously, it can be very time consuming to spend 2 hours on somebody's hair that's like mine. So if you had gotten a diagnosis from a doctor or somebody else, I mean, is there really any negative effect of just having somebody else do it because you don't want to do it?
If you have the fiscal means to do it, if you want to pay someone else to do it, fine. It's a free market economy. That's great. But as long as you realize that you could buy a product that costs as little as $10, maybe $8 even, 10 minutes of treatment, and then you're done. End of story. Maybe you have to treat twice, about 10 days later. These salons generally charge somewhere between $100 and $125 an hour to pick over whatever it is on the hair. Now the prescription products that actually do work better because there's less resistance to those can be also $100, $125 for a treatment. But if you have good insurance, a good HMO plan with a decent subsidized prescription plan, $15, $20, it's easy. Okay, so what do? There's no one size that fits all. This is hard to read, but I have this on a website, an external website. It used to be at Harvard, but now I have it here, an entity outside of here. So if you discover nits, you look for eggs on a child's head. You don't find any, you relax, you smile, there's no need to do anything. If you do find what you believe to be nits, you inspect the hair for live lice. If you don't find live crawling lice, again smile, and then you can periodically inspect the hair. But no need to treat unless you actually find live crawling lice. It's very simple. A lot of parents will treat presumptively. They think the kid must have lice, he or she's scratching before they're going to treat, or they treat prophylactically, which never is a good idea. Okay, so recommended responses if you have a child with lice. Well, if this is in a school, document the findings. Yes, there are lice here. Confirm that they really are lice. I suggest notifying the parent or the guardian at the end of the day. Too many schools will pick up the phone immediately and say, you got to get Johnny or Jane out of here immediately. They're not welcome. But no. I mean, by the time a school finds lice on a kid's head, the kid's been infested for a month or more already. So what's a few more hours? And then provide educational information on the biology and management so the parents can deal with it. And I already mentioned unjustified responses, exclusion, notifying others, violates HIPAA and FERPA, mass screening, applying pesticides to classrooms and buses would be a violation of the label, in fact, and restricting headphones and helmets makes no sense. So now, finish up. Policies. What are the issues with those? So you have a kid who comes to school infested with lice on his or her hair. And that invariably leads to this sort of issue. You get misinformed and angry parents screaming, and on the other side, misinformed and angry school personnel. And in the middle, I didn't put it on here, would be the screaming principal or superintendent who is listening to the yelling from both directions and often will respond in the wrong way to alleviate the amount of screaming that's occurring. And how is that? By sending the kid away. So, what's the basis for these policies that schools have to exclude kids? So these are called no-nit policies, but they could be no-mouse policies. So they're meritorious in principle. They seek to reduce the incidence or the prevalence of head lice. And what's wrong with them? There's no scientific or medical objective basis for these policies. They've never been shown to work. They ignore the distinctions between head and body lice. People often say, we have to do this because the lice are bad for kids, they're going to transmit all sorts of things. No, body lice transmit infections and are a real public health problem. Head lice don't fit that. Diagnosticians, whether it be a school nurse, a parent volunteer, whoever, they generally don't have the relevant training to know what they're looking at. They don't have a microscope, they wouldn't know which end to look through in most cases, and they're not regulated. Again, there's no justification for these policies, and they assume the transmission is likely within schools. It's not. They assume that any kind of louse egg, hatched and dead as well, is a sign of infestation, and they're viable and transmissible, and that that lice are burdensome to children, school personnel, and parents. But they're really not. They can be, but they're not necessarily. So a lot of school systems have, over the last 10 or so years, started changing their policies. And they're actually, at this point, falling like a bunch of dominoes. It's something I'm very happy to see. Some of the California schools started with this because of parental distress and inappropriate use of school nurse time. They were spending more than half their time every day looking at kids' heads rather than doing real health-related efforts. There was a tremendous absentee rate, and there was no evidence base behind these policies. So they decided, okay, there's no basis to have the policy, get rid of it. And they did. And so parents and some school personnel screamed, oh, you can't get rid of these policies because the lice will be marauding down the corridors of the schools, carrying children. There'll be nothing to keep them in check. Well, none of this happened. And the best case is New York City. More than 10 years ago, I advised them, and they got rid of their policy. And the louse situation there is no worse than it was before they got rid of the policy. But their absentee rate has changed for the better. So CDC says students diagnosed with live head lice do not need to be sent home early from school. The American Academy of Pediatrics, no-nit policies for return to school should be abandoned. The National Association of School Nurses is their position that Management of pediculosis infestation by head lice should not disrupt the educational process. No diseases associated with head lice. Children found with head lice should remain in class. So these are pretty important and influential groups. But a lot of school systems say, we don't care what government says or these medical groups say. We're going to do what we think is best. So, okay. I left a couple minutes for questions. I could go on for hours. Now,
What do you think is the best topical pesticide to use in terms of the organism's resistance and its effectiveness?
okay, so I have a flow chart on my website. It basically says, it starts out, first and foremost, make sure you're dealing with a bona fide, genuine, active mouse infestation. So that's the first question. The second is, do you even need to treat? Can you use a comb? And I already went through this. If the hair is easily combed and you have the time and the visual acuity to see what it is you're doing and you physically are able to do it, then that perhaps is all you have to do. But sadly, more often than not, combing fails because people don't know how to do it. They use the wrong kind of comb. They don't spend the right amount of time, and so on. So what do you use? My recommendation is go and get an over-the-counter cheap preparation of an FDA registered pediculicide. So anything containing pyrethrins or permethrin. Put it on, 10-minute application, and then you wash it off down the drain. The risk to a louse can be profound, can be deadly to them. That's why you use these products. The risk to a human being, virtually zero. So, if it works, you're golden. You spent 10 minutes and about $10, and you may have to treat again about a week later. Why? Because these products tend not to work well against the eggs. So the hatchlings come out, 9-10 days later, they've matured to the adult. So you want to hit them before the next generation starts laying another round of eggs. So sometimes 2 treatments is necessary. If you see live lice the day or 2 days after treatment, after the first treatment, and you're certain that you applied it correctly, you left it on the right amount of time, you didn't over dilute it, then you should look at everybody else in the house because the siblings might have lice, the parents might have lice and not even know about it. And then if you find it, those people should be managed accordingly as well. If you've done everything right and you still have lice, then there's a good chance that those lice are resistant to this class of insecticides. Nothing surprising, the insecticides didn't cause resistance, they just aided the spread of resistance through the population. So then at that point, you call the pediatrician and hopefully they will write a prescription for one of these FDA registered prescription products. Costs a lot more, but you're likely that you're going to have resolution of the problem within a few days. End of story. And again, you can kill the lice, you can even kill the eggs with some of these products, but the eggs will remain on the hair. And so, quick story, back when I was screening thousands and thousands of kids for head lice, there was one in particular, sort of the poster child describes this. There was this lovely, maybe 10-year-old girl with hair down to here, nice blonde hair, perfectly clean, could have eaten off of it. She came to my station, and I could see even before she was 5 feet away that there was something strange about her hair. It was glistening. It looked like somebody had poured glitter on her hair, but it wasn't glitter. She had thousands and thousands of head louse eggs on her hair. And she sat down, and before I even got close to look at her hair, she said, "I know I had them, but I don't have them now." Okay, so I took a look, and she was right. So hair grows from the base outwards about 1/4 of an inch on average per month, for most people. And the females lay their eggs on the hair shaft within a few millimeters of the scalp level. So as the hair is growing away, it's carrying this egg with it that's been cemented onto the hair shaft. And you can tell by how far away it is how long it's been on the hair in most cases. So she had her story made perfect sense. 3 years earlier, she had had a really good case of head lice. There were no eggs, though, between scalp level and shoulder level. But from here down to her waist, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of eggs. But there was nothing living.
Why did she not comb those?
Because she liked her hair. And it was too difficult and painful to take all the eggs out. And they sparkled in the sun. So she was okay with it. The teachers and some of the parents of other kids were absolutely horrified. But there was no reason. They all said, she has to be treated. What? You can't kill something that's not living. These are all hatched eggs. So no matter how much you want to kill them again, you can't. They're never going to come back to life. So she simply, people who have had chicken pox, while you are infectious, you have a little pustule on the skin, or many of them, and while they're open, you are infectious to others. But once it's crossed over, and for lifelong thereafter, you're not infectious. But to look at a kid and say, the scars from your chicken pox from 4 months ago, you have chicken pox, you can't be around us. No, I mean, it's a sign of what was, not a sign of what is. The same thing with this. So, yeah.
What about types of hair that are there any characteristics of people that are better hosts, and how do you see a live head louse?
Use your eyes.
Is it easy to see?
If you can read the newspaper with or without glasses, and you can see a period at the end of the sentence, then you can see the smallest head louse. You may not recognize what it is, but you should be able to see it. And type of hair, they don't care about the color, the length. As long as you have enough hair for the lice to hold on to, that's all that's necessary. The only oddity is, in this country, and I mentioned this, black children. Again, whether they be foreign national or African American. For every one black child that we saw with head lice, we would see 9 to 10 cases of head lice in kids of all other groups. Why might that be? I've got my own pet theories. Sadly, there's a lot of prejudicial nonsense that's made its way into literature. They don't taste good. No, it probably has to do with the level of hair care that they receive and some of the products that are used within that community that actually tend to reduce transmission. There's also behavior on the part of people, and this is a sad thing, and I've seen it in many, many schools that I've gone into. Kids tend to self-segregate by group. So you get the Japanese kids sitting over here, the black children there, the Jewish kids over there. It happens. It's a sad state of affairs. But if you're hanging around other kids that have a very low prevalence rate, you're less likely going to be exposed. If the kids all behaved equally towards each other, which we did see in a lot of schools, then they're all going to share equally or more equally in their head lice. So it's just a thought that I